Greetings, everyone. A small country, one of the poorest in Eastern Europe, yet it holds the key to triggering the collapse of a superpower system. Moldova, a land that once seemed hopelessly trapped among the ruins of the post-Soviet era, has now become the focal point of a tense and dramatic geopolitical confrontation. These will be explained by the main points below. The Transnistria warehouse and the geopolitical trap, a massive Soviet-era ammunition depot, just a few steps from the Ukrainian border, is turning into a ticking time bomb for a regional disaster if any incident occurs. Faced with this dangerous move, what will the Kremlin do with the EU? Activating a self-destructive scenario to defeat the Kremlin, facing the brutal pincer from Russia's $350 million manipulation campaign, Moldova unexpectedly turned the tables with a crazy plan by Bedinso, ready to erase borders to merge directly into a NATO member country. The poorest country in Europe also dares to challenge Russia. After Ukraine and Armenia, Moscow's historical sphere of influence is collapsing rapidly as the poorest country in Europe boldly breaks the gas blackmail. The horrifying truth is Russia is losing its ultimate weapon it relied on for so long. Here is the content and detailed analysis. Putin's second major failure, Moldova, and with a fierce counterattack, the Kremlin has lost all its ground in Eastern Europe. Before we get into the content, I hope you can take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe, Moldova stands out like an unhealed wound of history, a small, impoverished, and one of the most vulnerable countries in the region. Landlocked and completely lacking in mineral resources as a foundation, this country has been left isolated amid the ruins of the post-Soviet economy. The greatest tragedies of Moldova do not only lie in its geographical or economic disadvantages, but in an existential crisis that threatens its very survival, the silent disappearance of a nation. Over the past 3 decades, a historic mass migration has swept away between 1 and 1.2 million citizens, equivalent to a quarter of the workforce in their prime working age. When waves of young, educated people leave and never return, the lifeblood of the country is drained, leaving businesses facing a severe labor shortage and causing national budget revenues to collapse. With an average per capita income of only about $8,000, a figure that is extremely modest compared to the European Union average, this country's economy has to desperately rely on agriculture and remittances from abroad, which account for up to 15% of household income. International analysts do not hesitate to call this a country that is gradually fading away, where the vicious cycle between demographic decline and economic crisis is strangling any hope of revival. However, fate seems to challenge Moldova with an even harsher blow, as geopolitical pressure from outside combines with internal decay caused by the shadow of corruption. For the Kremlin, leader Vladimir Putin has never abandoned his ambition to consider Moldova as an obvious backyard in the grand scheme of restoring his influence and empire over the past decades. Moscow has used every heavy-handed tactic, from illegally maintaining a garrison of troops in the breakaway region of Transnistria in the east, to using energy as a strategic weapon by suddenly cutting off gas supplies in the harshest winter months, threatening to plunge an entire nation into freezing cold and darkness. This intervention is so sophisticated and insidious that official intelligence reports have exposed Russia funneling over $100 million in dirty money in just a dozen election cycles to buy votes, manipulate the political scene, and create internal chaos. That external devastation is further compounded by the internal corruption of the oligarchic era manipulated by Vladimir Putin. The climax was the shocking scandal in 2014 when corrupt politicians stole up to $1 billion from the banking system, wiping out 12% of the GDP in a single spectacular fraud. The mastermind behind this major case, Ilan Shor, is currently hiding in Moscow and continues to serve as a strategic pawn for the Kremlin to manipulate Moldova's politics. However, the Kremlin's pragmatic calculations on paper were completely shattered by the strong will of the people in the capital, Chisinau. Moldova has decided not to kneel before the whirlwinds of pressure. The historic turning point occurred in the winter of 2025 when Russia launched a gas blockade in an attempt to subdue this nation. Instead of surrendering, Chisinau achieved a miracle by completely breaking away from dependence on Russian energy, quickly shifting to alternative solutions from Europe, and reducing the direct economic influence of Moscow to just 0.2%. No longer held hostage by energy blackmail, the will of the Moldovan people is now strongly oriented toward the West, with support for European integration reaching between 60 and 70%. For the younger generation and the middle class, the European Union is not just an economic alliance, but a lifeline that brings the freedom of movement, civilized infrastructure, and a standard of living, values that oligarchic, frigid Russia cannot compete with. Facing this life-and-death chess game, President Maia Sandu bravely declared that joining the European Union is Moldova's national survival strategy to uphold democracy. She is leading the poorest country in Europe through fierce storms of pressure from Russia, while resolutely implementing painful reforms to break away from a legacy of corruption, aiming for an independent judiciary, fighting against corruption, making public procurement more transparent, and building a long-term responsible governance system. And then, a groundbreaking geopolitical shift officially erupted, opening a new chapter for the fate of this country. On June 15, at the Intergovernmental Conference held in Luxembourg, the European Union officially launched accession negotiations with Moldova and also opened the negotiation process with Ukraine. The two countries sitting together at the EU negotiation table is the clearest sign of the former Eastern European sphere of influence's decline. In the initial phase, 5 key and vital chapters have been opened to comprehensively challenge Moldova. EU Enlargement Commissioner Martikos has praised Moldova as one of the candidate countries with the most impressive roadmap, and Moldova is expected to open the remaining chapters before the end of summer, aiming to be ready to become an official member by 2030. Moldova is no longer alone on its journey. It is now determined to decide its own fate, resolutely breaking the chains to save the future of its people. Moldova's fate has never been that of a lonely island, because right beside them is Romania, not just a major neighbor, but also their closest relative and the strongest support in both history and bloodline. The bond between these two countries exceeds that of a typical alliance. A process of de facto reunification has quietly begun without waiting for an official legal decision, clearly shown through the wave of passports, economic integration, and cultural blending. Activating the mortal enemy scenario to defeat the Kremlin. The climax of this strategy reached its peak in January 2026, when President Maia Sandu made a bold and unexpected move, announcing that she would vote in favor in a referendum on unification with Romania. Consider this a survival-oriented plan. If the process of joining the European Union is delayed or stifled, merging with Romania will be a lifeline, ultimately resolving Moldova's security and economic crisis. The support rate for unification has skyrocketed in both countries, surpassing 50% when including the diaspora communities abroad. Although President Nikilo Zan of Romania has cautiously stated that Bucharest is ready if the people of Moldova desire it, the situation still needs more time to develop. Clearly, both sides of the Ruth River are mentally prepared for a historic shift. This is a scenario that the Kremlin will never be willing to accept and will use every brutal tactic to crush. To prevent this scenario of annexation and Western European integration, the Kremlin has set up a sophisticated hybrid warfare front, appointing the fugitive oligarch Ilan S.H. Ethadur as the commander-in-chief of covert operations in Moldova. Ahead of the 2024 elections, Ilan S. Ethadur's network launched a systematic vote-buying campaign on an unprecedented scale, alongside information manipulation operations backed by artificial intelligence sweeping across social media platforms. Russian-controlled television channels continuously bombarded Moldovan households with Kremlin propaganda, forcing the government to freeze and block their broadcasts. The dark nature of the massive financial flows behind these campaigns was only truly exposed in June 2026 through a shocking investigation by Novaza Gazeta in Europe. The report uncovered more than 83 million euros in credit funneled directly into companies sponsoring Ilan S. Ethadur's project, originating from financial entities controlled by Zoman Abramovich, the former owner of Chelsea Football Club, and Arkady Sotenberg, a childhood friend of Vladimir Putin. The report revealed that the international funds were routed through Kyrgyzstan to evade Western sanctions, and, even more alarmingly, millions in credit from this operation included financial groups controlled by Abramovich, the football club owner, and Arkady Sotenberg, who supported the brutal war in Ukraine. On the diplomatic front, the pressure also reached a suffocating level when the Russian ambassador in Chicago, Laoy Osorov, publicly challenged Moscow's constitutional neutrality, making accusations that Ukrainian military transport planes frequently landed at Bakhmut airport. This was a risky move aimed at cornering Putin, turning him into a participant in the war in the eyes of the public and undermining his position. Please subscribe to the channel to receive the latest information. The process of joining the European Union began, but the Kremlin's harsh strategies, including financial control and manipulating about 350 million USD, collapsed before the will of the Moldovan people. President Maia Sandu, in the land of golden fields, is maintaining a majority in parliament, and the trust in Western Europe is not only undiminished, but also increasing strongly. President Maia Sandu was re-elected, her party kept its parliamentary majority, and trust in Western Europe rose significantly. The geopolitical analysis clearly shows that every clear intervention from Moscow becomes a powerful push, driving the targeted countries to even faster Western lines. However, the Kremlin still holds a highly dangerous physical card under its control, managed by Arkady, a longtime friend of the Chelsea Football Club, and Arkady Zotenberg. The ministry has remained completely stagnant since previous decades, with towering Lenin statues on the streets, the hammer and sickle symbol engraved on buildings, and an atmosphere filled with Soviet aesthetics. Breaking away from Moldova in 1992 after a brief but bloody conflict, this region exists as a self-proclaimed nation unrecognized by the international community. But in reality, it is completely manipulated by Russia, with about 1,500 troops stationed there under the guise of peacekeeping forces. Even more frightening, in the village of Kobashna lies one of the most dangerous military legacies in all of Europe. A massive ammunition depot storing up to 20,000 tons of Soviet-era weapons, located just 2 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and exactly 200 kilometers from the Romanian border. Moldova has systematically refused all requests to inspect the ammunition depot because its very existence serves as the ultimate excuse for them to maintain troops in this strategic region. President Vladimir Putin has no intention of letting go of that grip. In 2026, he signed a special decree to speed up the process of granting Russian citizenship to residents of Transnistria, a move that President Maia Sandu exposed as a disguised effort to force military conscription. The field psychological analysis reveals a painful but objective reality. Most adults in Transnistria are trying to flee to the territory controlled by the Moldovan government out of an overwhelming fear of being forced into the flames of an unjust war. Seeing through this weakness, Moldova's strategy toward Transnistria does not choose a military solution, but instead strikes directly at its economic lifeline. Russia's decision to cut off gas supplies in the middle of winter has ironically shifted the advantage to Moldova, because Transnistria itself also suffered heavy losses from this sanction, making the people there suddenly realize that they cannot rely on just one side. The wave of people crossing the river to Moldova to look for jobs is increasing, creating an opportunity for Moldova to tighten its economic grip on the separatist regime and plan to replace it with an international management mechanism. A pressing geopolitical question arises. Can Moldova confidently join the European Union when the Transnistria issue has not yet been resolved? The strongest and clearest answer was affirmed by the European Union Enlargement Commissioner, Marta Koss, in February 2025. If Moldova successfully steps through the door of the European Union, a terrifying military paradox will emerge on the ground. 1,500 Russian soldiers and 20,000 tons of outdated ammunition would suddenly be stationed on official European territory. Facing such a situation, Moscow is forced to choose between 2 bitter scenarios: either humiliatingly withdraw its troops or accept a direct confrontation in a tense standoff with the entire EU bloc. French diplomats have begun to express deep concerns that Transnistria could become a dangerous backdoor for Russian intelligence to infiltrate espionage and sabotage operations deep into the heart of Europe. No matter which scenario occurs, it will be a geopolitical nightmare for the Kremlin, but it is a golden opportunity for Moldova to break free from its chains. That nightmare does not stop at Moldova's borders, because the country's shift is triggering a devastating domino effect. Europe's poorest country challenges Russia. This failure not only caused Moscow to lose Moldova, but also shattered the illusion about the effectiveness of hybrid warfare tools. And now Armenia is on the verge of a third defeat for Russia. After Moscow's betrayal and abandonment during the crisis over control of the Karabakh region, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan made a historic pivot to the west. Armenia officially joined the International Criminal Court, ICC, unilaterally froze its relations, and created a clear distance from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, led by Russia, while also opening new security and strategic dialogues with the United States and France. Even the plot by the oligarch Ilan Shor's network to interfere heavily in Armenia's election has completely failed. The Kremlin's complex weapons are collapsing like dominoes across the post-Soviet space. Although the situation in Georgia is somewhat more complicated, as the current government still maintains close ties with Russia, the wave of public outrage is rising on the streets, demanding the right to join the European Union, creating overwhelming social pressure. Even in Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan have also quietly begun to draw boundaries to separate themselves from Russia's orbit, shifting toward a multilateral foreign policy and quietly challenging Moscow's dominance in the region. Looking at the overall picture, Russia's historical sphere of influence is not only shrinking, but is on the verge of complete collapse, and Moldova is the proud symbol of that collapse, a former Soviet republic, the smallest, poorest, and weakest, but bravely turning straight toward the West despite all the pressure and resolutely refusing to look back. If a country like Moldova can do that, then other countries can do it too, and the Kremlin understands this systemic risk very well. In your view, are there any neighboring countries still willing to support and follow Putin?